Bitcoin has reached a new all-time high, surpassing $108,000, driven in part by President-elect Donald Trump's pro-crypto stance and plans to establish a national Bitcoin reserve. Here to help us understand the implications of the Bitcoin surge is Ben Cowen, prominent cryptocurrency analyst and founder of Into the Cryptoverse. Ben, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. A pleasure to be here.
You must get really annoyed that you have to explain to dopes like me some of the basics here. But let's just start with the question that I've heard a number of people ask, mostly people who have sold Bitcoin at a pathetically small price compared to where it is now. Why the surge? Give us a kind of idea of why this went from 60 to almost double to 108,000.
Am I allowed to share my screen here to show you a couple of charts, or should I just explain it?
You can just explain it because I think that would get very complicated for me.
Fair enough. Yeah, so normally Bitcoin sees a surge like this exactly in Q4 of halving years. So Bitcoin had a halving earlier this year in April, and this is actually following almost identically the 2016 cycle. And there's actually a lot of similarities between now and 2016. Q4 2016, we also saw Trump become the president-elect. And during Q4 2016, we saw Bitcoin go up, we saw the dollar go up, and we saw the long end of the yield curve go up. So this almost feels like a carbon copy of 2016. Now, essentially what happened in March is that Bitcoin kind of got ahead of itself, right? It was accelerating a little too quickly for where Bitcoin normally is at this point in the market, or at that point in the market cycle. And so essentially, we saw Bitcoin drop for about 6 to 7 months, which is exactly what it did last cycle in the year that we got rate cuts, to help the cycle kind of get back in line with where it should be. And then it's just basically taking on the same course that it always does, getting a move up in Q4 of the halving year. In fact, if you look at the average year-to-date return of Bitcoin in halving years, the current halving year is tracking the prior average almost perfectly.
So if you forget about, any irritations that you might have with Donald Trump's policy on anything but Bitcoin and just focus entirely on Bitcoin, is he, the president that you prefer just on this issue? Because I know he talks a lot about it. He doesn't seem to understand it when he talks about it, but he's getting positive signals from people in his universe, obviously. I mean, what is the major difference here policy-wise? Is it a deregulatory thing?
I think it could be a lot of deregulation. There's been a lot of cryptocurrencies that have been kind of hammered down for a long time. And, obviously Bitcoin, there was a scare going into the election as well as to what, who was actually going to win, what policies were ultimately going to prevail. But listen, I mean, if I'm being completely honest, Bitcoin to some degree exists outside of politics. And the reason I say that is because, Bitcoin was created in 2009, and we've actually had an array of different administrations, throughout Bitcoin's history. And no matter who was in office, it's done pretty well. So there's no denying that Bitcoin likes the deregulation component and the idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. I mean, obviously that would go quite a long way if that actually comes to pass. But in the same way, I actually am a big believer that narrative follows the price and not the other way around. I think that the narrative follows the price. Price does not follow narrative. And so this is normally when Bitcoin moves up. It's normally when it expands in the cycle, and it's doing the same thing it always does.
I mean, explain the strategic Bitcoin reserve, which you seem to be bullish on. I mean, we tend to think about Bitcoin as being something completely outside of governments. I mean, we've seen governments bet heavily on it, particularly in Central America. Everyone knows what I'm talking about. But if you are somebody who says, hey, this is a great thing, explain to the average person who's just kind of a casual Coinbase person, maybe, or somebody thinking of getting into it, like why something like that would be a positive thing for Bitcoin, and I presume would juice the price a little bit too.
Well, in the short term, it certainly could juice the price. I mean, if you have, the United States government essentially adding Bitcoin, that would, in the short term, I imagine it would be a good thing for Bitcoin. I guess the bigger question is, as you kind of alluded to earlier, right? There's a lot of politicians that talk a big talk when it comes to to Bitcoin and crypto. But are they actually, do they know what they're talking about? And are they actually going to follow through? Or is it just an empty promise? So that's kind of, I think, the big question right now is that, and that's another reason I think Bitcoin could be surging, is because it's essentially surging into the idea of this strategic Bitcoin reserve that people are going to be expecting sometime after Donald Trump gets elected or sometime after he takes office. But if he doesn't, once he's inaugurated, there actually could be a correction in the market. There's normally a correction in the market in January of post halving years. And I think it could be due to some uncertainty as to whether you're even going to get the strategic reserve. Because, it's likely not going to happen on day one.
Yeah.
There's probably going to be a lot of convincing that needs to be done. And so I'm actually kind of expecting a correction after, sometime after the inauguration, because the market, kind of like it did a year ago, is accelerating into something that it's not even sure if it's going to happen. Once it actually happens, that's a different story. So yes, I mean, if they do eventually add one, I would argue in the short term, it's probably a good thing. If they don't add one, then it would probably be a bad thing and lead to a longer correction in the market, because I think to a large extent, the market's pricing that in.
I'm going to ask you for some advice, but not investment advice. I'm going to ask you for how to explain something to friends of mine. We try to be a little remedial here because we're not a crypto channel. We don't do this stuff. We're going to explain to people what this stuff is. But I was having a conversation at dinner the other night, and we were talking about this amazing price surge, but not everyone at the table was really clued in. They didn't really know what was happening, what was going on. And, you get the FOMO and there's people like, oh, maybe I should get involved in this. But the one thing that I found very interesting was that two people said the same word when they heard crypto, not Bitcoin. They said, it's just a bunch of scams. Like, this is like so many, and we're talking about what people call shit coins and these scam coins. And we've seen a recent one with the Huck Tua girl, which I can't believe I know who that is, but that was a scam coin. And so this stuff really weighs on people. It really infiltrates their brains. I mean, as someone who knows this stuff very well, deeply, when the average kind of normie says to you, isn't this just a wild west of tulip speculation and phoniness and people just kind of doing what they call rug pulls and just taking money from people? How do you explain to people that, well, maybe that's not everything and maybe that stuff needs to be regulated? How do you talk to people about these kind of what I presume you believe are misconceptions about cryptocurrencies?
That's honestly a really great question, and it weighs on me a lot too. I think the right answer is that 99.99% of the space is a scam. Right?
Oh, really?
A lot of them are. And the reason I can say 99.99% is because there's, at this point, there's probably hundreds of thousands of cryptocurrencies, right? I mean, there's so many that launch every day. There's meme coins that launch every day. And eventually they asymptotically will go to zero. They don't provide any value. And so ultimately that is the path that I see for them. But I think that people should distinguish between Bitcoin and crypto. Bitcoin should not be held responsible for the greed that, people exhibit in other parts of the market, right? I mean, Bitcoin does its thing, but this is a great opportunity to introduce something that I've been talking about for a long time, and that is Bitcoin dominance. So back in 2022, back in 2021, Bitcoin dominance was only about 38 to 39%. So the market cap of Bitcoin relative to the entire space was only about 38 to 39%. We just saw Bitcoin dominance surge to over 60%.
Yeah.
So Bitcoin actually is slowly eating into the market share of all these other cryptocurrencies. And I think that it can be easy to be distracted by all the scams and all that stuff and to sort of, forsake Bitcoin to try to make a quick buck over here on a meme coin. But the reality is that Bitcoin has historically been the way to go. It's the long-term king of the space, the long-term champ, and not everything else. I mean, I do think there are other cryptocurrencies that have a spot, but most of them are scams. And I think that's one of the reasons why social interest in crypto today is actually less than it was in 2021. I tracked that. And we're actually averaging about maybe 40 to 50% of the interest we were averaging in 2021. I think a lot of people have decided not to come back precisely for what you said. I mean, they've been burned on scam coins.
No, I remember in 2021, I mean, you point out that date, and I mean, we forget things at this point, but that was, I mean, we're in the thick of COVID and we're getting checks from the government. Well, some people were, some people weren't. And I remember this number that I saw, that the number of people that had taken their government checks and invested in crypto. And I assume, like you say, meme coin. For the people who don't know that, like these are coins that basically perform, or crypto currencies that perform basically no function, right? I mean, they're just, you're betting and speculating on something that someone created. Whereas Bitcoin and sort of competitors like Ethereum, they actually do things, right? I mean, is that the fundamental difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's actually some type of utility there, and it's not just, the community is great, therefore we should buy into this asset. That's what a lot of them sort of operate under, is we have a great community and you should buy us because the price is going to go up. And I think to some degree it's it's a function of just excess liquidity in the system. I think there's a lot of excess liquidity, and I think that when there's a lot of excess liquidity, that liquidity wants to find a home. Yeah. It starts with assets like bonds and stocks, and it works its way out on the risk. It works its way out the risk curve. Eventually gets to Bitcoin and Ethereum. And if there's too much liquidity, it eventually reaches the meme coin market, which is there's no real utility there.
Well, I thought it was funny that Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk are heading a kind of quasi government department, which isn't really a government department, called Doge, considering that like we're going to cut nonsense and waste, and it's like Doge itself doesn't do anything. It is kind of nonsense. So maybe you're learning lessons from that. Okay, but I'll let you go, but I can't. I have to be the boring idiot who asked the question that $106,000, which you can buy tiny fractions of. Would you recommend to people right now hold off on buying Bitcoin, because January is coming and we're going to see this kind of bottom out a little bit? What are your predictions for us?
Yeah, I mean, so I have like a risk metric that I use for Bitcoin. Right now, the risk on it is like 0.65. So it is a little heated, but also market cycle tops that we get about every 3 to 4 years usually occur once the risk level is, above 0.8. So that would suggest there is still some room for Bitcoin to run. But if you are buying Bitcoin now, for this cycle anyways, like, most of the gains are probably behind us for at least this cycle. That doesn't mean you can't make money on it. It just means that it might not be as of a long-term trade as if you'd bought some in 2022. But listen, the right strategy for something as volatile as Bitcoin, no one can predict what it's going to do. The right strategy is, if you believe in it long-term, DCA is the way. No one has a crystal ball.
Ben, I have to ask one more thing. I'm sorry. How much did it cost when you invested in the first time in Bitcoin? How much was it?
So I first got interested in Bitcoin in 2011. But I was a math.
Oh, you were interested, but you weren't investing.
Yeah, I know. I don't even remember the first price exactly, but I first got interested in 2011. I was taking cryptography class because I was doing my undergrad in mathematics, but I had no money. I was a poor college student, so I didn't get in until a few years after that. And then even when I got in, I still didn't make any money on it because I made all the mistakes that everyone makes, right? I buy at the top, I sell at the bottom. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't really feel like I really understood how the cycles worked until we got to the 2016, 2017 cycle. That was when I finally started making money off of this stuff by trying to buy when there's, blood in the streets and sell when everyone's screaming that it's going to go to 1 million.
All right. Well, Ben, we'll let you go get your coffee in your new Bugatti or whatever it is that I'm sure you drive now. Ben Cowen, thank you so much. You can find him on YouTube. He's a interesting and polarizing guy, Ben. I have to say that people get very heated about your predictions and your comments. Thank you so much for joining us. Next time we have a big Bitcoin thing, we're going to call you. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks for having me.